300 people simply do not vanish. Not from a locked plantation. Not on a Christmas morning. Not without a single sound. Yet on December 25, 1859, that is precisely what occurred at South Carolina's Belmont estate. At dawn, when the overseer came to unlock the quarters, the doors remained barred from the outside, exactly as he had left them the night before. The chains that had bound the workers lay coiled upon the ground like shed skin. The tools stood arranged in perfect rows. Cooking fires still smoldered, but every single person was gone. No footprints led away through the frost. No boats were missing from the river dock. Bloodhounds brought from neighboring plantations circled the empty quarters and sat down, confused, as if the scent just ended. The plantation owner, Thomas Vance, offered a reward equal to $500,000 today. Newspapers across the South published descriptions. For months, slave catchers combed 3 states. They never found a single person. Not one body, not one witness, not one clue that made sense. What they discovered in the following weeks would raise questions the authorities desperately tried to bury. Questions about what had truly been happening at Belmont in the months before that Christmas. If Mysteries History tried to forget intrigue you, subscribe to this channel. We dig into the stories meant to stay buried. And this one goes deeper than anyone expected. Before we continue with the tale of Belmont Estate and the 300 souls who vanished, let us know in the comments what state or city you're listening from. We want to know where our community of mystery seekers watches from. Now, to understand that Christmas, you must understand what Belmont Estate was, and what it had become in the year before everything changed. For the disappearance did not happen in a vacuum. It was the culmination of months of careful planning, desperate hope, and something far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. Along the Combahee River, about 40 miles southwest of Charleston, Belmont Estate sat on 1,100 acres. It wasn't the largest plantation in the Low Country, but it was among the most profitable. Rice built fortunes in South Carolina, and Thomas Vance had inherited one of the finest rice operations in the state when his father died in 1855. For 3 generations, the estate had been in the Vance family. Thomas's grandfather, William Vance, bought the land in 1798 from a fleeing British loyalist family after the Revolution. Using knowledge borrowed from enslaved Africans who understood the complex irrigation, he built the first rice fields. By the time Thomas inherited it, Belmont was producing nearly $40,000 in rice annually, an enormous sum that placed the Vances among the region's wealthiest. A white columned structure visible from the river, the main house was designed to impress visitors arriving by boat. Its 12 rooms included a library filled by Thomas's father with books on agriculture, philosophy, and classical literature. Furniture was imported from Europe. The family crest was on the silverware. Everything about the house projected permanence, prosperity, and respectability. Behind it stretched the rice fields, vast geometric plots separated by dikes and irrigation canals controlling the river's flow. Orderly and almost beautiful from a distance, the fields were brutal up close. Rice cultivation required workers to stand in water for hours, sometimes waist-deep, exposed to disease, snakes, and South Carolina's suffocating summer heat. Malaria was common. Accidents were frequent. The work destroyed bodies. A separate compound about a quarter-mile from the main house, the quarters were positioned so the sounds of daily life there, crying children, evening songs, arguments, grief, could not reach the main house. 32 cabins arranged in 4 neat rows. Each housed between 8 and 12 people. The structures were simple, wooden frames with gaps between boards, dirt floors, a single fireplace for cooking and heat. In summer, they were ovens. In winter, they were barely adequate shelter. There was a communal cooking area with large iron pots, a small infirmary, really just another cabin with a few medical supplies, and surrounding it all, a fence. Not a high or strong fence, but a boundary nonetheless, a line defining where people were permitted to exist. By 1859, Belmont held 307 enslaved people. The oldest was a woman named Dinah, believed to be in her 80s, though no one knew for certain. Early birth records weren't kept for the enslaved. The youngest were infants born into bondage, their futures already determined. The population included skilled workers, carpenters, blacksmiths, seamstresses, cooks, midwives. There were field workers who understood the rhythms of rice better than any overseer. House servants moved through the main house like ghosts, present but invisible, seeing everything and saying nothing. And there were the children, dozens of them, from infants to teenagers. They worked, too, once old enough. The youngest carried water, the older ones learned trades or joined field gangs. Childhood, as such, barely existed. Thomas Vance was 31 the year of the disappearance. He'd inherited the plantation at 27 after his father's sudden stroke and death. Educated at the College of Charleston in literature and philosophy, he'd returned to learn the practical business of plantation management. By all contemporary accounts, he was unremarkable, not particularly cruel for the time, but not kind either. He was a businessman who saw the plantation as a machine and its workers as components. He kept detailed productivity records, calculating the cost of feeding and clothing workers against their output. He made decisions based on profit margins. He rarely visited the quarters, leaving day-to-day management to his overseer, William Trent, a man who had worked at Belmont for 15 years. Trent was efficient, methodical, and utterly indifferent to the humanity of those he supervised. He enforced rules, maintained discipline, and ensured work quotas were met. Nothing more, nothing less. For years, life at Belmont followed predictable patterns. Seasons dictated the work: planting in spring, tending in summer, harvest in fall, maintenance in winter. Sundays offered a brief respite, a few hours to tend garden plots, mend clothes, or simply rest. Christmas brought a day or two of reduced work, a tradition most owners observed partly from custom and partly from a belief that small concessions prevented larger rebellions. But in March of 1859, something changed. Thomas Vance traveled to Charleston for an agricultural society meeting, where plantation owners shared information on crops, markets, and labor management. He returned 3 days later with a guest, Dr. Silas Cratton. Dr. Cratton was not a medical doctor, though he used the title. He held a degree in natural philosophy from what he claimed was a Pennsylvania university, though later investigations revealed inconsistencies in his credentials. He was 43, tall and thin, with dark hair graying at the temples and eyes that seemed to catalogue everything. He had spent years traveling through the Caribbean and South America, studying what he called labor efficiency systems. He'd observed sugar plantations in Cuba, coffee plantations in Brazil, and mining operations in Peru. He'd taken notes on how different populations responded to management techniques. He developed theories on human behavior, motivation, and control. And he came to Belmont with a proposal Thomas Vance found irresistible. Cratton claimed he could increase the plantation's productivity by 40% within a year, without buying more workers or land. His method was scientific, based on observation and principles developed through years of research. All he needed was access to the enslaved population and the freedom to implement his system. Vance, always seeking higher profits, agreed immediately. He offered Cratton room and board in the main house and a generous fee payable at year's end if results materialized. Cratton arrived with 3 large trunks of equipment. He spent his first week observing, walking the fields, watching people work, taking notes in a leather-bound journal he carried everywhere. He spoke only to Vance and Trent. He simply watched. Then he requested a workspace. Vance gave him an outbuilding previously used for storage. It was about 30 by 20 feet with a wooden floor, solid walls, and a few small windows. Cratton had the windows covered with heavy cloth. He installed serious locks, the kind used on Charleston warehouses. He brought in furniture, a desk, chairs, shelves. He unpacked his equipment, brass instruments with dials and gauges, glass containers, leather straps mounted on wooden frames, notebooks, writing implements, and lamps that burned with unusual brightness. Workers who glimpsed inside described things they didn't understand, diagrams on walls, charts with numbers and symbols, strange tools that looked like they belonged in a doctor's office or a workshop. Within 2 weeks of his arrival, Cratton began what he called assessments. The first group, 5 people, 3 men and 2 women, all field workers in their 20s and 30s, was brought to his building on a Monday morning in late March. Trent escorted them and left them there. They emerged 6 hours later. They were quiet, subdued in an unusual way. When asked what happened, they gave vague answers. "He measured us," one man said. Asked questions, a woman added. Nothing more. Over the following weeks, every person at Belmont underwent an assessment. Cratton worked methodically, bringing in groups of 5 or 6 at a time. Sessions lasted 4 to 8 hours. What happened inside would later become a subject of intense speculation and horror. From survivor testimony and fragments of Cratton's discovered notes, we can piece together some of it. Cratton measured everything: height, weight, arm span, hand size, chest circumference. He measured how far people could reach, how much they could lift, how long they could stand. He timed how quickly they completed simple tasks, picking up objects, moving across the room, responding to commands. He asked hundreds of questions about their families, childhoods, fears, dreams, what made them angry, sad, or obedient. He asked about relationships with other workers, overseers, the Vance family. He took notes on everything. Each person had a file, pages of observations in Cratton's precise handwriting. Then came the tests. These were more disturbing. Cratton presented hypothetical scenarios and asked how they would respond. He showed objects and asked for uses. He gave pointless tasks, arranging blocks in patterns, repeating number sequences, standing in uncomfortable positions for extended periods, and observed their reactions. Some found the assessments merely tedious. Others found them deeply unsettling. Something about Cratton's manner, the way he watched, wrote in his notebook, seemed to look not at them but through them, created profound unease. But assessments were only the beginning. Once his initial observations were complete, Cratton began implementing his system. The work schedule was restructured. People were reassigned to different tasks based on criteria only Cratton understood. Some field workers moved to maintenance, some house servants were sent to the fields. The changes seemed arbitrary, but Cratton insisted they were based on careful analysis of capabilities and psychological profiles. Rations were adjusted. Some received more food, especially those Cratton identified as high-value workers. Others received less. The reductions were small at first, barely noticeable, but they created a new hierarchy. Work quotas were modified. Some tasks now had specific time limits. Failure meant corrective interventions. Then came the treatments. These began in May, about 2 months after Cratton's arrival. Workers showing signs of reduced efficiency, illness, exhaustion, moving too slowly, were taken to his building for correction. These sessions were different. They lasted longer, sometimes a full day, and people returned changed. The changes were subtle at first. A talkative field worker named Marcus returned quiet and focused, working faster, never pausing to rest or speak unless spoken to. His wife said he barely slept, he'd lie awake staring at the ceiling as if he'd forgotten how to rest. A woman named Lily, recovering from a fever, returned moving mechanically, as if her body operated on instructions her mind wasn't processing. She'd start a task and continue until physically stopped, even if it was complete. A young man named Benjamin developed a constant hand tremor after treatment, making fine work difficult, but he never complained, just worked through it, expressionless. By summer, fear spread through the quarters. People whispered about Cratton's building. They called it the correction house or simply his place. Parents warned children to work hard, to never give Trent or Cratton reason to notice them. But working hard wasn't always enough. Cratton's criteria for treatment expanded. At first, it was only the sick, injured, or exhausted. Gradually, others were selected, those who asked too many questions, formed close friendships, sang certain songs, told certain stories. It was as if Cratton was trying to identify and eliminate some quality he saw as problematic. Then people started dying. The first death was in early July. Henry was 32, a strong, healthy field worker at Belmont his entire life, known for working long hours in brutal heat without complaint. He had a wife, Clara, and 3 children. In late June, Cratton selected him for treatment. The reason wasn't clear. Henry hadn't been sick or slow. Trent brought him to the correction house on a Tuesday morning. He emerged 2 days later. Clara said he was different immediately. He wouldn't speak or eat. He'd stand in their cabin staring at the wall for hours. When she tried to touch him, he flinched. In the fields, he worked with strange intensity, moving faster than seemed humanly possible, never stopping. Others tried to talk to him, but he didn't respond, as if he couldn't hear or had forgotten how to process language. After 4 days, he collapsed. Others carried him to the infirmary, where he lay on a cot, eyes open but unseeing. He died that night without ever speaking again. The official cause was listed as fever, but everyone knew that wasn't right. Henry hadn't had a fever. He'd had something else, something done to him in Cratton's building. 3 more people died over the next 2 weeks. All had recently undergone treatment. All exhibited similar symptoms: withdrawal, mechanical behavior, inability to eat or sleep, followed by sudden collapse. Cratton showed no concern. When Vance questioned the deaths, Cratton explained some subjects were incompatible with the optimization process. It was unfortunate, he said, but inevitable. The benefits to the overall system outweighed the occasional loss. Vance, focused on improving productivity numbers, accepted this. But in the quarters, the deaths created a crisis. People were terrified. They didn't understand what was happening in the correction house, but they knew it was dangerous. They knew being selected might mean death, and they had no way to refuse. In August, a woman named Ruth tried to run. She was 24, a house servant in the main house kitchen, selected for treatment and scheduled to report the next morning. Instead, she ran at night, taking nothing, heading north through the woods. She made it 6 miles before dogs found her at dawn. The punishment was public and brutal. Vance, rarely involving himself in discipline, made an exception. Ruth was whipped in front of everyone. But that wasn't the end. Afterward, she was taken to Cratton's building for behavioral correction. She was inside for 3 days. When she emerged, she could walk and work, but she never spoke again, not a word, not a sound. Her eyes were open but empty, as if something essential had been removed. People who knew Ruth said it was like looking at a shell. The person who had loved singing, told funny stories, dreamed of freedom, was gone. What came back was something else. The incident with Ruth marked a turning point. Before, there had been fear. Now, there was terror. And beneath the terror, something else grew: rage. But rage alone wasn't enough. The people at Belmont had learned through generations that open rebellion was suicide. The system of laws, weapons, dogs, neighboring plantations ready to send reinforcements, was arrayed against them. If they were to act, they needed to be smart, careful. They needed to plan in a way Cratton, with all his observations and theories, would never detect. If this disturbs you as it does us, hit that like button and let us know in the comments what you think was really happening in Cratton's building. Because what comes next reveals that while Cratton thought he controlled everything, he missed the most important thing happening right under his nose. The truth is, while Cratton conducted his experiments, convinced he was breaking individual will and preventing collective action, the people of Belmont Estate were doing something he never anticipated: they were organizing. The organization began in the most unlikely place, among the children. Enslaved children occupied a strange position, too young to be seen as serious threats, too small for constant surveillance. They moved through spaces adults couldn't, carrying messages between fields and quarters, running errands to the main house, playing in ignored areas. And they watched everything. In the months after Cratton's arrival, children began exhibiting strange behaviors adults noticed but overseers didn't. They'd gather briefly in specific locations, behind the woodshed at dusk, near the old well, between 2 cabins where shadows fell just right. They'd sing certain songs with seemingly innocuous lyrics carrying embedded meanings, songs about rivers, stars, and journeys passed down through generations, containing maps and instructions disguised as melodies. One song included the lines, "When the master sleeps and the river runs, we'll follow the drinking gourd to the promised sun." The drinking gourd was a known code for the Big Dipper used to navigate north. But when the master sleeps and the river runs were specific temporal markers, instructions for timing. The children were messengers. A child bringing water to the fields might pause to sing a particular song within earshot of certain workers. A child playing near the main house might repeat a phrase that was actually a coded message. And the adults were listening. The planning began in April, shortly after Cratton's assessment started, with a man named Samuel. Samuel was 41, a skilled carpenter at Belmont for 23 years. His skills gave him unique freedom of movement. He repaired buildings, built furniture, maintained structures, allowing him to move between the main house, quarters, outbuildings, and fields without suspicion. He also had access to places others didn't. In early April, repairing a door at a storage building, Samuel noticed something. Cratton's building had a root cellar. He discovered it accidentally while checking the foundation for water damage. Tapping the ground, he found a hollow sound. Further investigation revealed a wooden trapdoor hidden by overgrown grass. It was locked, but Samuel was skilled with locks. He returned at night alone and opened it. The root cellar was larger than expected, about 10 feet square with a dirt floor and stone walls, clearly old, built when the structure stored food years earlier. But what caught Samuel's attention was a gap at the bottom of one wall where stones didn't quite meet the ground. Cool air flowed through. Samuel investigated further. The gap led to a tunnel. The tunnel was old, part of the plantation's original drainage system from decades earlier, designed to divert water from rice fields during heavy rains. Replaced years ago with a more efficient design, the old tunnels had been sealed and forgotten, but this one wasn't completely sealed. It was still passable. Samuel explored as far as he dared that first night. The tunnel was about 4 feet high and 3 feet wide, shored up with rotting but mostly intact timber. It ran underground toward the river. He couldn't follow it all the way, not enough light, and he needed to return before being missed, but he'd seen enough. The tunnel was a way out. Over the next week, Samuel told 3 people, his wife Rachel, and 2 men he trusted absolutely, Daniel and Joseph, both field workers, strong and smart, with families desperate to protect. They began to plan. The tunnel needed clearing. Parts had collapsed, debris blocked sections, weak points needed shoring. They needed to determine where it led and if it was passable to the river. And they needed to do it all in secret, underground in Cratton's own building. It was audacious and dangerous, but possible. Samuel had learned to pick the lock on Cratton's building. It was good but not perfect. He could open it in under a minute. They began working at night. Small groups, never more than 3 or 4, would slip into the building after dark, access the root cellar, and spend hours clearing the tunnel. They worked in complete darkness, unable to risk even a candle. They moved debris by hand, feeling their way, shoring up weak points with stolen timber. It was exhausting, terrifying work, cramped, airless, with constant fear of collapse and discovery. But they continued. By June, they had cleared nearly 100 yards. They discovered the tunnel ran about 200 yards total, emerging in a wooded area near the river, away from main buildings. The exit was partially concealed by undergrowth, sealed years ago with a rotted wooden cover. With work, it could be opened. They had their escape route. Now faced a bigger challenge, moving 300 people through a narrow tunnel in one night undetected. The planning became truly complex. Timing had to be perfect, a night with relaxed security, distracted overseers, maximum time before discovery. Christmas was the obvious choice, the one day with a brief respite, overseers off, main house celebrations, lowest security. But problems remained. Cabins were locked from outside every night. Chains binding flight risks were secured with locks only Trent and Vance had keys for. They needed to solve these and coordinate 300 people, men, women, children, elderly, sick, to move silently and quickly through a tunnel accommodating only a few at a time. Planning consumed summer and fall. More people were brought into the conspiracy, but carefully, selectively, only those who could be trusted absolutely, who understood a single mistake or betrayal meant death for everyone. They developed a system of signals. Certain songs and phrases carried instructions. Children became primary messengers, carrying information seemingly innocently. They stockpiled supplies, small amounts of food from rations, water containers, blankets hidden in the tunnel. They made contact with the Underground Railroad, the most dangerous part. The network extended into South Carolina but was secretive, fragmented, under constant threat. Contact required finding someone trustworthy to arrange boats waiting at the river on Christmas night. Samuel made contact through a free black ferryman on the Combahee River. Messages passed through a chain of intermediaries, each knowing only what they needed. By December, the plan was in place. On Christmas Eve, while the main house celebrated and overseers relaxed, people would move through the tunnel in carefully timed groups. Strongest first to help others, families together, elderly and children assisted. They'd emerge near the river where Underground Railroad boats waited, take them downstream to the coast, transfer to a ship north to Philadelphia and freedom. It was an impossible plan requiring perfect timing, coordination, and luck. But it was their only plan. Then, 2 weeks before Christmas, something threatened to destroy everything. Dr. Silas Cratton discovered their planning. The discovery happened on December 10, 1859. Cratton was working late, reviewing notes and preparing reports for Vance. Productivity numbers were excellent as promised. But Cratton had noticed odd inconsistencies in recent weeks. Certain exhausted workers showed unusual energy, isolated people displayed coordination signs, behavior patterns didn't match predictions. Cratton believed in patterns. His system assumed human behavior was predictable, controllable, measurable. When patterns didn't match, he investigated. That night, organizing files, he heard a faint scraping sound from below. He froze, listened. It came again, from the root cellar. He took a lamp and descended. The trap door was closed, but fresh scratches were around the lock. Someone had been opening it. Cratton opened it and descended. He found the tunnel immediately, and evidence of recent use, fresh footprints, disturbed debris, the smell of human sweat. Someone had been using his building to access an underground passage. Cratton understood immediately an escape route, a secret passage beneath his workspace. He should have alerted Vance, called Trent and overseers, sealed the tunnel, identified and punished conspirators. But Cratton didn't. He saw an opportunity, the ultimate test of his system. A population under extreme duress, facing a binary choice between action and submission, would reveal the limits of behavioral conditioning. If his treatments had suppressed their ability to organize, the attempt would fail. If not, he'd learn where his system had weaknesses. Either way, data would be invaluable. He decided to let the attempt proceed, but he would control it. He would be in the tunnel observing, documenting. To him, it was the experiment's culmination. He spent the next 2 weeks preparing. He hired 2 men from Charleston, hired muscle asking no questions. He told them they'd help prevent an escape, paying well for silence. He studied the tunnel, mapping length, identifying weak points. He positioned supplies, ropes, tools, weapons, strategically. And he waited. He told neither Vance nor Trent. This was his experiment, he would control every variable. But Cratton made a critical error. He assumed the planners operated on instinct and desperation, that they were disorganized, their plan crude and easily disrupted. He was wrong. The people of Belmont had been planning for 8 months. They had anticipated problems, had backup plans, and had something Cratton never understood: they had each other. On Christmas Eve, as the sun set over the Combahee River, final preparations began. In the quarters, people moved through evening routines normally, cooking, tending children, singing. But beneath the surface, signals passed, final instructions given. People said goodbye to places they'd lived, graves of family, small pieces of life built in captivity. At the main house, Thomas Vance hosted a Christmas Eve dinner for neighboring plantation owners and their wives. Candles lit the dining room, the table laden with food, wine flowing freely. Vance was in excellent spirits, the year profitable, Cratton's system working, the future bright. In the overseer's house, William Trent sat with his wife, drinking whiskey, looking forward to a rare day off. He'd locked the quarters himself. Everything was secure. In Cratton's building, the doctor waited in the root cellar darkness with his 2 hired men. He had an unlit lamp, a pistol, his notebook. He was ready to observe. And in the quarters, as the last light faded, Samuel picked his cabin door lock. The escape had begun. The first group entered the tunnel at 8 p.m. Samuel led 5 strong men to clear obstacles and help others. They moved silently through darkness, feeling along walls, counting steps. Behind them, more groups came at timed intervals. Families stayed together, the elderly were assisted, children carried. Everyone moved in complete silence. The tunnel was cramped, terrifying, air thick and stale, darkness absolute. But people kept moving, driven by freedom at the other end. By 9 p.m., nearly 100 people had entered. That's when Cratton made his move. He lit his lamp. Sudden light blinded people. They froze, confused, terrified. Cratton stepped forward, his men flanking him, positioned halfway through where the passage narrowed. "Stop," he said, voice echoing. For a moment, no one moved. People in front were trapped between him and those behind. People behind sensed something wrong. Cratton raised his pistol. "You will return to the quarters. This escape attempt is over." But then something happened he hadn't anticipated. Someone started singing, a woman's voice from darkness behind him. One of the songs children had sung for months, about the river and drinking good and promised son. Other voices joined. Then more. Within seconds, dozens sang, sound filling the tunnel, echoing, amplifying until overwhelming. Cratton's hired men looked nervous. One raised his weapon, but singing continued, growing louder. And people started moving forward, not running or attacking, but walking steadily toward Cratton and his men. Cratton fired his pistol into the air. The sound was deafening in confined space, but people kept coming, kept singing. One hired man panicked and ran, pushing past Cratton toward the root cellar. The other followed. Cratton found himself alone, facing a wall of people moving with inexorable determination. He turned and ran, but in panic made a fatal mistake. He dropped his lamp. It shattered on stone floor. Oil spread and ignited, flames racing across ground and up wooden supports. Fire spread quickly, old, dry timber caught easily. Within seconds, a tunnel section was engulfed. People screamed. Forward movement stopped as those in front tried retreating from fire, but too many pushed forward unaware. Tunnel filled with smoke, heat became unbearable, supports cracked and splintered. Then a section collapsed, about 30 feet from where Cratton stood. Tons of earth and stone came down, blocking passage completely. People ahead of collapse, first groups including Samuel and leaders, were cut off from those behind. In chaos, darkness, smoke, screaming echoing, Samuel made a decision. "Keep moving," he shouted. "Forward! Get to the river!" The group ahead of collapse, 17 people total, pushed through smoke and heat. They heard collapse continuing behind, felt ground shaking, but didn't stop. They reached tunnel end, emerged into cold night air. Boats waited as planned. They climbed in, pushed off downstream into darkness. Behind them in the tunnel, 283 people were trapped. What happened to those 283 in hours after collapse is one of America's most haunting mysteries. When investigators excavated tunnel weeks later after discovering the 17 survivors in Philadelphia, they found the collapse section. They cleared it, expecting hundreds of bodies, victims of cave-in and fire. They found nothing. No bodies, bones, clothing, personal effects. The tunnel beyond collapse was empty. Investigators were baffled. They brought engineers, miners with cave-in experience. They searched every inch from root cellar to river exit. Nothing. as if people had simply vanished. Several theories were proposed. Bodies consumed by fire didn't make sense. Fire intense but brief, burned out quickly. Fire doesn't completely destroy remains. Bones should have remained. Bodies washed away by water, tunnel part of drainage system, perhaps water flooded after collapse. But examination showed no flooding evidence, ground dry, no water marks, no active waterways. Survivors removed bodies, made no sense. 17 escapees barely made it out themselves, no time to move hundreds of bodies, and where would they take them? Mystery deepened examining Cratton's building. They found dozens of notebooks revealing experiment extent, treatments, psychological techniques. But the final notebook, kept weeks before Christmas, contained increasingly erratic entries. Early December, the subjects are exhibiting unexpected patterns of coordination. My conditioning protocols should have prevented collective action, yet I observe signs of organization. This requires further investigation. A week later, I have discovered their escape route. Rather than prevent it, I will allow it to proceed under controlled observation. This presents an unprecedented opportunity to test my system's limits. December 24th, final entry, handwriting barely legible, words running together, they are not what I believed. The conditioning did not. The tunnel is, they are singing and the sound I cannot, entry ended mid-sentence. Cratton's body was never found. Neither were his hired men's bodies. Mystery consumed local authorities for months. Disappearance of 300 enslaved people was a massive financial loss Thomas Vance couldn't afford. He offered enormous rewards, hired private investigators, traveled neighboring states searching. He found nothing. The story spread through the South, creating panic among plantation owners. If 300 could disappear from a locked plantation without trace, what did that mean for system security? Newspapers published wild theories, elaborate abolitionist conspiracy, people smuggled to Caribbean or South America, supernatural explanations, quickly dismissed. No theory explained physical evidence, or lack thereof. Then 3 weeks after disappearance, the 17 survivors were discovered in Philadelphia. Discovery should have solved mystery. Instead, it deepened it. The 17 were found hidden in the hold of the merchant vessel Meridian Star, departed Charleston 2 weeks earlier. They were emaciated, dehydrated, terrified, but alive. Federal marshals under Fugitive Slave Act took them. Thomas Vance traveled to Philadelphia to reclaim his property, but the 17 refused to speak in front of Vance or authorities. They would only talk to Margaret Lindsay, a Quaker abolitionist aiding freedom seekers for years. Lindsay met them in jail, spent hours listening, taking notes. What they told her was documented in letters to fellow abolitionists, later published in anti-slavery newspapers, authenticity fiercely disputed by Southern publications. According to accounts, escape had been planned 8 months as suspected. Tunnel cleared in secret, timing calculated, boats arranged through Underground Railroad contacts. Everything went according to plan until Cratton appeared. Survivors described confrontation, Cratton's lamp, pistol, demand to return, singing starting spontaneously, people moving forward despite threat, fire and collapse. But then accounts became fragmented, contradictory. A woman recorded only as either told Lindsay something not in official reports. Near the front close to making it through before passage blocked, she heard screaming at first, then screaming stopped, and she heard something else, singing from deeper in tunnel where others were trapped. Not screaming or crying, singing the same coded songs children had sung for months. It was like they knew, said. Like they'd planned for this, too. Like collapse wasn't the end. It was part of something else. Lindsay pressed for details. Couldn't explain, only knew what she heard, singing growing louder, echoing as collapse continued. Another survivor, Peter, claimed he was near the back of group that made it through. He looked back just before final collapse, and in flame light saw something nonsensical, people, he couldn't tell who, deliberately pulling down support beams. Not accidentally or in panic, deliberately, methodically bringing down tunnel behind them. They were sealing it, Peter said. On purpose. They didn't want anyone to follow. Lindsay asked the obvious, why seal themselves in? Peter had no answer, only knew what he saw. A third survivor, young Sarah, told yet another story. In days before Christmas, whispers in quarters about a second plan. She didn't know details, adults were careful around children, but heard fragments, something about the deep way, something about where the masters can't follow. She remembered the phrase repeated often in final days, if the first way fails, we take the deep way. Lindsay documented all accounts, sent letters to abolitionist newspapers, testified before anti-slavery societies, used story to fuel opposition to slavery. But accounts were so contradictory, strange, many dismissed them as exaggerations or fabrications. Southern newspapers claimed Lindsay invented it for abolitionist agenda. The 17 survivors were returned to slavery under Fugitive Slave Act, transported back to South Carolina in chains, but never returned to Belmont. Thomas Vance, perhaps fearing they'd inspire others, sold them to different plantations across state. They were separated, scattered, stories lost. Margaret Lindsay continued searching for answers, corresponding with abolitionists, never finding anything. In months and years following, scattered reports suggested missing people might have survived, found freedom, but each raised more questions. February 1860, rice merchant Thomas Garrett, traveling coastal swamps 15 miles south of Belmont, found a recent camp, warm ashes in fire pit, signs many people there, makeshift shelters, discarded tools, but empty. Search party found no trail, swamp vast, treacherous. Authorities concluded runaways from various plantations, didn't connect to Belmont, but timing and scale, dozens, perhaps hundreds, suggestive. April 1860, ferryman Jacob Mills on Savannah River reported transporting about 40 black travelers one night. They paid in gold coins, unusual, enslaved didn't have gold. Group quiet, organized, purposeful, crossed at night into Georgia, disappeared into woods. Sheriff found no trace. Mills couldn't provide descriptions. Stark, interested in gold. Story dismissed as unrelated, Georgia far from Combahee River. But gold interesting, where would escaped slaves get gold? June 1860, shopkeeper in Wilmington, North Carolina, reported selling supplies, food, blankets, medical supplies, more than one person needed, to a woman with unplaceable accent, paid in cash, polite but distant, vague answers when asked where from. Shopkeeper remembered her speech, like she'd forgotten how to form certain words, like relearning language. Report dismissed, North Carolina farther from Belmont. But description matched people who underwent Cratton's treatments, struggling with language, memory. Could she have been one of the missing? If so, how get to North Carolina? Other reports scattered across South over next 2 years. Black travelers on Virginia Road, free black community appearing suddenly in Tennessee, rumors of secret settlement deep in Appalachians. None confirmed, none definitively connected to Belmont, but together suggested possibility at least some missing survived, escaped, found ways to live free. But what of the 283 trapped in tunnel? If died in collapse, where bodies? If escaped another route, where gone? What did survivors mean by the deep way and where the masters can't follow? In March 1861, weeks before Civil War began, something reignited interest. A package arrived at Charleston Mercury newspaper offices. A small wooden box, carefully wrapped, no return address. Inside, a single chain, one found at Belmont Christmas morning, chains that had bound individuals, found unlocked, carefully arranged. Accompanied by note on good paper in careful, elegant script, we are not lost. We are free. And we remember. Unsigned. Newspaper published brief article describing chain, transcribing note, speculating on sender and meaning. But nation consumed by approaching war, South Carolina seceded, Fort Sumter attacked within weeks. Belmont mystery faded from attention. Thomas Vance lost plantation during war. Union Army occupied Low Country 1862, Belmont abandoned. Enslaved who remained, those not disappeared, were freed. Vance never recovered financially, died 1867, still offering reward, still searching. Dr. Silas Cratton never seen again after Christmas Eve 1859. family in Pennsylvania, contacted by investigators, claimed no knowledge of his South Carolina work, said he'd always been secretive. Investigators found much of his background fabricated, claimed university had no record, claimed papers didn't exist. Cratton as much a mystery as disappearance. Tunnel filled in eventually. Belmont buildings torn down 1880s, land sold, subdivided. Rice cultivation declined as economy changed. Today, a small historical marker near where Belmont stood mentions plantation's role in rice cultivation, notes abandoned during Civil War. It doesn't mention disappearance, 300 vanished, Cratton or experiments. Story largely forgotten, but mystery remains. Over years, historians proposed various theories. Mass death in tunnel, most straightforward, 283 died in collapsed fire, bodies lost or destroyed. Problems, fire doesn't completely destroy remains, tunnel examined thoroughly, should have been evidence. Perhaps bodies removed later by survivors or others hiding evidence, logistically impossible, moving hundreds through collapsed tunnel required enormous effort, time. Alternative escape route, trapped people found another branch of old drainage system investigators didn't discover. Plausible, Belmont drainage extensive, not all mapped, possible other tunnels, exits discovered in desperation. If escaped alternative route, might have emerged far from plantation, scattered into landscape. Doesn't explain singing survivors reported or deliberate collapse Peter witnessed. Why seal tunnel if trying to escape? Underground railroad, network more extensive, organized than believed, evacuated trapped people through secret means. Appealing, gives hopeful ending, but difficult to support with evidence. Underground railroad active in South Carolina but operated in small groups, moving people carefully, slowly. Evacuating nearly 300 from collapsed tunnel seems far-fetched. Maroon communities, missing people established hidden settlement in swamps or mountains, living free away from white society. Maroon communities existed throughout Americas, including U.S., Great Dismal Swamp on Virginia-North Carolina border harbored such communities decades, South Carolina, Georgia swamps could provide similar refuge. Reports of camps, settlements after disappearance support this. Perhaps missing joint established community lived in secret years or decades. If true, why no definitive evidence ever found? Why no one came forward after Civil War, slavery abolished? Deliberate concealment, missing died in tunnel, deaths concealed by authorities not wanting story public. Disappearance of 300 enslaved people, massive embarrassment to South Carolina plantation system, suggested insecurity, could inspire other attempts. Perhaps authorities removed bodies, buried secretly, claimed found nothing to minimize impact. Dark but not impossible, cover-ups common in antebellum South. Doesn't explain survivor reports in other states, packaged to Charleston Mercury, testimonies of 17 escapees. Truth is, we may never know what happened to the 283. But one more piece of evidence emerged decades later, suggesting a possibility no one considered. 1930s, Great Depression, Federal Writers Project sent interviews across South to record testimonies of formerly enslaved people. 1937, in rural Georgia, interview Helen Crawford spoke with elderly black woman giving name only as Aunt Bess, believed 80s, born into slavery, lived through Civil War, Reconstruction, difficult decades. Crawford asked about slavery memories. Aunt Bess spoke of plantation where grew up, work, lost family. Then Crawford asked if remembered anything unusual, any stories stuck with her. Aunt Bess quiet a long moment. Then, I remember before the war. I remember people talking about the plantation where everybody walked away. Down in South Carolina near the river. My grandmother told me. She said it was a Christmas miracle. Crawford asked her to explain. My grandmother said they didn't run. They walked together. And they went somewhere the masters couldn't follow because masters didn't believe it existed. Crawford asked what she meant. Where did they go? Aunt Bess smiled. Freedom. She said they went to freedom. And once you really believe in it, really believe it's possible, you can find ways to get there nobody else can see. Crawford pressed for more details. Did grandmother know anyone from that plantation? Know what actually happened? Aunt Bess shook head. My grandmother just said sometimes when people have nothing left to lose, they find strength they didn't know they had. And sometimes when people work together, really together, they can do things that seem impossible. Paused, added, my grandmother said the masters never understood that. They thought if you broke people down one by one, you could control them. But they didn't understand breaking people down could also bring them together, that shared suffering could become shared strength. Interview preserved in Library of Congress, Federal Writers Project collection, brief, few pages, no concrete information about Belmont. But offers perspective white investigators, reporters 1859 never considered. Perhaps missing people didn't escape in spite of what Cratton did, perhaps escaped because of it. Cratton's experiments designed to break individual will, create isolated, controllable subjects. But perhaps instead created shared trauma binding people together more strongly. Perhaps treatments, fear, deaths forged collective determination stronger than any individual will. Perhaps singing in tunnel represented not panic or despair, but unity, declaration they were together, would face whatever came as one. Perhaps the deep way survivors mentioned wasn't physical route, but psychological or spiritual journey undertaken together, transformation allowing survival in ways oppressors couldn't understand or track. Speculation, of course, unprovable. But explains why bodies never found, why survivor accounts contradictory, why sighting reports scattered, vague. Perhaps people of Belmont didn't just escape, perhaps they transformed, found way to exist so different from masters' expectations they became, in effect, invisible. What do you think happened? Leave thoughts in comments. If this made you think about history's mysteries, share video, hit like, subscribe for more. More mysteries wait. Belmont mystery never officially solved. 17 survivors captured in Philadelphia, returned to slavery, freed during Civil War, most disappeared into Reconstruction chaos, later lives unknown. Margaret Lindsay continued abolitionist work until death 1879, never stopped searching, never found definitive answers. Tunnel filled in 1870s when property sold, new owners wanted no reminders. Cratton's notebooks donated to Charleston Historical Society, stored largely unexamined until 1920s researcher discovered them. Notebooks revealed experiment full extent, psychological techniques, treatments, theories. Disturbing documents, evidence of systematic dehumanization disguised as scientific research. But also revealed Cratton wrong. His system assumed humans reducible to predictable, controllable components, will breakable, behavior shapeable, resistance eliminable through conditioning and control. Disappearance of 300 proved him wrong. Despite months of treatments, fear, trauma, careful observations, people organized, planned, acted collectively. Maintained hope, protected each other, found way to resist. Cratton's final notebook entry suggests he realized this last moments, they are not what I believed. The conditioning did not, discovered too late humans aren't machines, will cannot be completely broken, people, even in most desperate circumstances, can find ways to maintain humanity, fight for freedom. Chain sent to Charleston Mercury 1861 never traced to sender, but message clear, we are not lost. We are free. And we remember. Whether missing all survived, found freedom, established peaceful communities, remains unanswered. But perhaps most important truth, they tried. In face of overwhelming oppression, system designed to crush hope, 300 came together, attempted impossible. Planned months, worked secretly, risked everything. Christmas morning 1859, walked away from Belmont, leaving only chains behind. That act of collective resistance, regardless of outcome, stands testament to human spirit's refusal to be broken. Historical marker near Belmont site doesn't mention this, not disappearance, Cratton's experiments, 300 vanished. But story exists in archives, old newspapers, survivor testimonies, memories passed down. Exists in unanswered questions, what happened in Tunnel Christmas Eve 1859? Where did missing go? How did they survive if they did? What meant by somewhere masters couldn't follow? These may never be fully answered, but remind us history full of mysteries challenging understanding, resisting simple explanations, forcing confrontation with limits of what we know. Belmont story, one of those mysteries. 300 people don't just disappear. But maybe, just maybe, they found way to vanish more powerful than anyone imagined. Maybe found freedom not just as destination, but as state of being, something bloodhounds couldn't track, slave catchers couldn't recapture, system trying to break them couldn't destroy. Maybe that's what the deep ways meant, not physical root, but transformation so profound it made them invisible to those who only ever saw them as property. Maybe that's Belmont's real mystery, not where people went, but how they became free in a way oppressors could never understand or undo. This story shows even in history's darkest moments, people found ways to resist, hope, fight for freedom. What do you think really happened that Christmas night? Believe missing found freedom, or another explanation? Comment below, let's discuss. If enjoyed this deep dive into history's puzzling disappearances, subscribe, hit notification bell, never miss investigations into stories history tried to forget. Share with mystery lovers, check other videos on screen for more stories making you question past. See you next video. Belmont chains never found again after package to Charleston, Mercury. But somewhere in South Carolina, in swamps and forests reclaiming old plantation land, traces might remain of what happened that Christmas night. 300 people don't just disappear. But maybe they found way to vanish more powerful than anyone imagined. And maybe their story, how they came together, planned, walked away from bondage, is more important than knowing exactly where they went. Because walking away, choosing freedom facing impossible odds, is itself a victory. That victory, that choice, that moment 300 said no more and walked into unknown together, that's Belmont's real story. Story history tried to forget, but we remember.